later. So tonight's presentation will be an update on Rockford Dubuque passenger rail feasibility study by Dan Schulte, the project manager for the study. This program follows the April Ride the Rail webinar when we were given an update on the Chicago to Rockford passenger service that is expected to be done late in 2025. If you missed the April webinar, you can now watch the recording on YouTube in our playlist. We'll put the link to that in the chat. And while I have your attention, let me tell you about Ride the Rail. We're all volunteers with many different backgrounds who donate our time to bringing back the train because we believe our region needs a passenger rail connection. We're building a coalition of supporters along the route and our organization is growing. That's very good news, but we really need your help. If you have a few hours to spare for writing emails, video editing, tabling at events, or just talking to people, please let us know. Thank you. Now let me introduce Dan. I had the pleasure of serving on the Passenger Rail Committee as one of the stakeholders during the study, and I really admire Dan's openness and promptness whenever we had questions, even when we kept asking him to spell out abbreviations and explain train jargon. For 6 meetings starting in March last year, he kept us all on track. Although he did make us use Microsoft Teams for the meetings, which some of us found to be pretty painful. Had to put that in there. Schulte is the Senior Director of Engineering at Quandel Consultants with over 16 years of experience in passenger rail planning and design. Of local interest is that most recently he led the engineering team for the Illinois DOT Chicago to Quad Cities passenger rail project. And now here is Dan. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Hendrika. That was a very nice introduction. Pleasure to be here this evening with the Dubuque Ride the Rail group. And yeah, it's an honor to be in front of folks like yourselves. These grassroots get on passenger train movements are really needed in our, in our national effort to try to get passenger trains back to the way they used to be in this country and the way a lot of us see Europe and Asia doing things. So appreciate all your efforts and I'm happy to be here today. So as Hendrika mentioned, I work for Quandel Consultants. We're a Chicago-based engineering consulting firm. We're about 30 employees and we focus primarily on rail projects, and within rail industry, we do a lot of passenger rail, commuter rail, and intercity especially. And I think I saw Mark Walburn on this call as well. Mark is a former employee of Quandel and I think recently retired. So thanks, Mark, for joining. He also was part of our consultant team on this Rockford to Dubuque feasibility study. So this presentation that you'll see today, many of you on this call have seen a lot of this content before. And as Hendrika mentioned, Ride the Rail did sit on the steering committee. So, but before I get into the contents, I just want to say this study was organized by a great group of community regional leaders. If I can get this to work. Click on the screen here. Sorry, guys. There we go. This wasn't just a, hey, hand the study over to the consultants and get back to us when it's over with. This was a collaborative effort. We had regular check-in meetings. Our consultant team did our best to seek input and enact this study in a transparent manner. So again, I'm appreciative of Ride the Rail for being a part of the project. It was a lot of fun. It took about a year. We got started, notice to proceed somewhere around March of 2021. And we got into this project to just continue the momentum, if you want to call it that had started with, or I guess IDOT had attempted to get started back in the 2010 era. Many of you on the call are aware of the history of the Chicago Dubuque, Rockford Dubuque service, which used to be operated by the Illinois Central called the Land of Lake, or Land of Corn. Until 1967, Amtrak picked up the service for a few years. Couldn't quite keep it going, and since 1981, there has been no service out to Dubuque. I guess I'll say the Midwest states who have primarily been sponsoring Amtrak service with the help of the federal government kind of started getting more serious about expanding passenger rail in the 90s. In the early 2000s, had a Midwest Regional Rail Initiative, a big planning study. Amtrak was kind of involved. Amtrak did an official feasibility study in 2007 that identified the CN route, or the former Illinois Central, now CN route, as a preferred alternative. The city of Dubuque did a study about the downtown station. And of course, in the 2010 timeframe, as part of the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, IDOT submitted and received funds to bring back Chicago to Dubuque service. And the state of Iowa kind of wasn't, changed hands at the governor level, wasn't very interested in that. And so IDOT tried to continue the Chicago Rockford service. That's been very slow to move. We heard about that from Scott last week. I'll talk a little bit about that because, of course, the Rockford to Dubuque leg is not going to happen without Chicago to Rockford. And I do want to mention that was kind of a fundamental piece to this study. With IDOT being on the steering committee, and quite frankly funding the study, they weren't really interested in looking at other options into Chicago. So in other words, you have to get to Rockford first, and then we can talk about how to get to Dubuque. So this study really looks at an extension service. Moving along, a couple things I like to bring up. Depending on the audience, I know you folks are a little bit more in the loop on the rail industry, but it's an intriguing time to be conducting a study like this because of the national, or at least the White House interest in funding more passenger rail projects. There's a very interesting ongoing STB hearing regarding Amtrak serving the former Gulf Coast route, which will be a precedent-setting ruling whenever that does come out. I'm sure all of you are aware of that, and I think it'll make waves in our passenger rail industry depending on how the STB rules on that. We've had a recent Class 1 merger, or attempted merger, still ongoing between Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern, which will affect this project. And then of course the freight Class 1s especially are moving to more of a bottom line type precision. They call it precision schedule railroading, which is affecting train lengths, number of crew members on trains. And as Dubuque knows, the trains are getting longer, and they're not necessarily serving the customer the way they used to. So I'll hold my opinions about precision schedule railroading, but needless to say, it does affect how these passenger studies and passenger planning happens. From the regional perspective, again, this is primarily an Illinois route, and of course, folks that live in the Dubuque area, the Iowa side, want to get to Dubuque or as far as they can, and primarily have to rely on IDOT and their projects. So we need to get to Rockford before we can get to Dubuque. And IDOT, as well as some of the other states that we work with, have had a challenging, I'd call it, about a decade, taking federal FRA money and trying to get advancements in intercity passenger rail. And a lot of hurdles over the past 10 years, and quite frankly, a lot of those hurdles haven't been solved yet. So, and then as many of you know that live up in the region, the Dubuque area, this is not the biggest city in the world, but it has great tourism. A lot of Chicago residents travel out to Dubuque and Galena on a regular basis. We heard from a lot of the Galena tourism folks that during the pandemic, they were seeing record traffic and tourism. And so, you know, getting a train involved in that intercity travel would be an excellent opportunity. A couple maps I like to show, and it may be a little bit hard to see, but I have a little pin there where Dubuque is, but this is the Canadian National Network, the purple line. And what's interesting about this is the Canadian National line that your route is on is really more of a branch line for CN. So I kind of see that as an opportunity. It's not their main line intermodal West Coast, East Coast of Canada down to New Orleans. It's a little branch line. So it's not the busiest main line out there. The BNSF is, sorry, this is the Canadian Pacific map. And of course, the CP runs right through Dubuque. And now that they are purchasing the Kansas City Southern, which is this leg down here, you can see how Canadian Pacific is directly competing with the CN for routes to the south, both through Houston and ports in New Orleans, with their traffic from Canada. So those two entities will be battling for every leg up that they can get over the coming years. And then finally, BNSF, which has a short but very important component or segment of the Rockford Dubuque route. As you can see, most of their northwest traffic to get to Chicago and southbound has to run through Dubuque. So this, bottom line, this is a very busy set of tracks that our passenger rail route is attempting to get on. Okay, so this feasibility study, we did a little bit of public involvement. I think Mr. Petrazza was involved, and some of you folks were involved in these focus group meetings. I wouldn't call it a full-blown public involvement, public engagement, but the steering committee wanted to at least hear from some of the public regarding their kind of desires, needs, concerns about this service. And the item I really need to focus on is the competitive with auto. And that was really a focus for this study was, hey, if passenger trains between Chicago and Dubuque are going to drive ridership and revenue, it needs to be time competitive, which essentially means we need to get this thing 4 hours or less. So that was a focus for us to see, is that feasible? Can we do that? The current intercity options are pretty limited. You can get a flight, pretty expensive, and I think there might be a daily flight to Chicago, but bus service is not great. I think it goes down to Galesburg and across, which is over 5.5 hours. So I doubt many people use a bus. And of course, as we've already kind of alluded to, the US 20 drive is not the safest thing nor the most time competitive either. But so the route is pretty straightforward. I'm showing the entire leg here. The Chicago to Rockford segment is, is out of our control. That's IDOT study. So they hand over some information to us regarding their current selected route, which is on a combination of Metra and Union Pacific, which would have intermediate stops at Elgin, Huntley, Belvedere, and potentially Marengo. The CN route is also shown. That was the former selected route, but currently is not being looked at that I'm aware of. So that would leave our Rockford to Dubuque path. We did look at a few other alternative routes down through the Rockford airport. However, that time competitiveness just cannot be achieved when you take anything but the CN. So we focused on the CN to BNSF route, stopping at Freeport and Galena before getting to Dubuque. Down below in this box, hopefully you can read it. This was a feasible schedule that Mark also worked on that shows that it is possible to get under 4 hours between Chicago and Dubuque. We quite frankly were pretty conservative, I would say, in our assumptions on pad time for freight movements and delays. So we're pretty confident that it can be done. Moving along. So the methodology of the study was essentially to answer some major questions. What's the most optimal service operation? What infrastructure would be needed to start service? What ridership could be expected? What will it cost to operate and maintain? What kind of benefits will the public see, and how can it be funded? And again, I want to stress this is feasibility level. This is a kind of a starter analysis to get the conversation rolling with the powers to be. This is not a full-blown demand ridership model. It's not a full-blown sit down the railroad and haggle over unit costs for ties and rail. This is a feasibility level, but considering Quandel and our partners are involved in a lot of Midwest projects, we feel pretty confident in our range numbers, which we'll talk about here in a second. So working with the steering committee, there's a few service alternatives that we thought were feasible, and we narrowed them down to basically 4 down at the bottom of the page. You have a 90 mile an hour maximum possibility or a 79 mile an hour maximum. And then the question was, well, how many times do you want to stop? So we talked a lot about that. We did analysis, some comparisons. The 90 mile an hour option, which in FRA lingo is called Class 5, requires a lot more physical infrastructure investment, particularly to the track infrastructure. And we estimated that about 30 to 40% bump in cost to do that. Then looking at what we were calling secondary stops, Winnebago, Lena, Warren, we heard from those communities that they would be interested in hosting a stop. And so we wanted to make sure everyone understood how that would affect the trip time. And so that turns out to be somewhere around 5 minutes of added time to stop at all those stops. And I forgot to mention the 90 mile an hour speed really only saves, again, about 5 or 6 minutes of trip time by going to 90 mile an hour. So the committee kind of agreed, hey, if we're we have to move forward with one alternative. Not to say these other alternatives couldn't be done in the future, but we had to focus on one alternative to pin down our numbers. So we went with the 79 mile an hour max, which is FRA Class 4, and stopping only in Freeport and Galena. So that was our screening analysis to narrow down to our selected alternative. The report itself goes into a lot more detail on the infrastructure. I'll kind of hit some of the highlights. We did do a cursory field inspection, and CN was, basically unresponsive on the study. We have some contacts at CN. They promised us information. They promised a lot of things, and then never really delivered. Mostly using the excuse that the merger, at that time, CN was actually the one looking like they were going to buy Kansas City Southern. Say, oh, we're too busy with the merger, and didn't respond to our requests of information. So we had to move ahead with our own information and what we could see from public right away, which you can actually tell a lot. So the things that were good was that this CN is investing in this line. We saw a lot of new grade crossing panels being dropped in. We saw a PTC, which is positive train control. And we can, if there's questions on PTC, you can answer them later. But that's a huge cost saver considering the PTC is already in place largely. There's a CTC centralized control signal system in place, but the bridges are in terrible shape. So we figured CN's gonna want some new bridges. The track infrastructure, the ties and the rail would need to be upgraded. They've got a little bit smaller weight rail than what is typically put in for modern passenger rail systems. So quite a bit of physical infrastructure upgrades. On the vehicle side, equipment, this is kind of one of the benefits of doing an extension service, is that IDOT is planning on buying new equipment for their Chicago to Rockford service. So if they're buying trains, and you can essentially, share cost by extending to Dubuque. And so, we think IDOT sees value in that. So we put in some costs, assuming that IDOT would purchase venture cars and charger locomotives similar to what's being put in service throughout the Midwest. And then on stations, Mark did an excellent job outlining talking with the communities and outlining the potential range of amenities that can be put in for stations, platforms. In Dubuque, the pretty obvious location for the station and layover facility is the city-owned spur right off of CN, right by the casino. So there's a little image of that there, but again, the study report actually covers each station and this particular amenities there. So getting on to, I think we got the costs next. Yeah. So these are the capital costs. We put together a range based on all these elements, and somewhere between 280 to 380 million. One question that we got from IDOT, their secretary, was, hey, are we going to be replacing the swing bridge across the Mississippi River? Well, we did make an assumption that no, that's a major infrastructure improvement. We do have a 30% contingency, which comes out to be about, $13 to $18 million, which could cover something like that. We know that CN has done some repairs recently to that bridge, but that's such a big unknown ticket item that we kind of assumed, at least from the passenger perspective, we don't need to run fast over a Mississippi River bridge. If it's functional, it's fine. We can operate at 5 or 10 miles an hour, and for a likely, I don't know, $60 million to $80 million project, we don't really see that as necessary for operating passenger trains. Then on the operating side of things, the annual expense, the way we did this was we looked at similar routes in the Midwest currently operating today. And Amtrak was very helpful in providing us data. I can't share which services this is, but they did provide some data, and we kind of extrapolated what that would look like for this service. So we're looking at a $7 to almost $10 million a year bill for operating these trains, and that's above and beyond Chicago to Rockford. Okay, and then so our ridership forecast, again, was a pretty basic analysis, and I am not a rail economist, but Bruce Horowitz, who did our numbers here, did more of an extrapolation from Amtrak data on current services, and estimated somewhere between 260 to 330 trips per day, and which results in about $2 to $3.5 million annually. So not atypical for Amtrak service to not be able to cover your operating expense through fare box revenue. So we have just kind of a list of some public benefits that come about and are typically quantified and qualitatively discussed in federal grant applications. Construction jobs, of course, we have permanent jobs created through serving the station, and some economic development type jobs are created. Safety benefits are a big deal when you're taking drivers off the road and putting them on trains. The Biden administration is very interested in climate change, and the air quality calculations are incredible when you compare an automobile emission to a train emissions, and they really make the case when you look at it from an economist kind of perspective of what a train can help the environment with. And then of course the qualitative things like quality of life and tourism benefits, transit-oriented development, lots of opportunities with passenger rail. So that's kind of an overview of the meat and potatoes of the study. What we did with the steering committee was we talked about, okay, where do we go from here? And the group, a couple things. One, IDOT has to be a key player in this, and so IDOT really needs to support this service. So we had a meeting with the secretary and talked about, and kind of used almost the exact same slides here, but talked about the benefits of this service. The other thing that we think is going to be vital to this service is the FRA. And so FRA has a process where called service development planning, and you have to follow the National Environmental Protection Agency law in any federally funded project. So you have to follow NEPA as well. So we kind of we put together kind of a scope of what we would do next if this project were supported by IDOT and the FRA, and it's a little bit hard to explain, but we call it pre-NEPA, and the reason why I call it pre is because I would say 3 or 4 years ago they changed the NEPA law that said once you start the official NEPA process, you only have 2 years to finish it. And passenger rail projects can never be done in 2 years. They take forever. Forever, I shouldn't say forever. They can take a long time, and so a lot of projects are starting to do these preparatory projects to lay down the foundation of a service development plan. And so it's a little bit of a deeper dive into operations modeling, train scheduling, dealing with the railroad, talking about what costs would be needed, doing some environmental screening, doing some more enhanced ridership, revenue forecasting, creating a BCA, and a newer trend in the industry is to start to look at more of a business case for intercity passenger rail, not just the public benefit, but a business case. And so there's a return on investment methodology that's come out recently from APTA and AASHTO that we think would be helpful for this service. I will mention, just hot off the presses last week, the FRA did publish sort of a notice, but it was a sneak peek into a new program they call the Corridor Identification Program, and gave us a little bit more detail into how they are planning to fund intercity passenger rail project in the future. The bottom line of that announcement, I don't know if anybody here read that, but they're creating a project pipeline. And basically, if anybody wants an FRA to support their project, they need to submit their project to their pipeline, get it on the list, and then start going through the federal grant, competitive grant programs, and work with FRA to plan your service. So again, I commend the steering group, the region, for getting this feasibility study done, because now you have a piece of paper that says, hey, we're interested in this, we've invested in it, and you're already a step ahead of a lot of places that want service or a return to service that haven't done anything. So Hendrika helped us, put a proposal to IDOT for another round of funding through their planning and research grant, which was submitted on March 30th by ECIA for that pre-NEPA, pre-service development plan phase. So I think IDOT is intending to announce that sometime pretty soon. I think June was the target date. So we hope to be hearing about a next step for the planning for this service. And with that, I appreciate everyone's attention. I'd be happy to take a few questions.